Hey, welcome back. So in the previous video, what we've done is we've created a bunch of, well, we've taken presets, we've applied them to the model, and then we've exported them using the file export textures. Once those textures were exported, I now want to, in this video, apply those textures within Houdini and render them inside of Redshift. So let us begin. First, what you're going to want to do is make sure that you have Redshift actually loaded. Then open up a tab. So sometimes if you don't have this visible, press the plus button, go to shelves, and click on Redshift, and this will make this tab visible. Next, under this button, Redshift, if you click it, it'll take you out into the, if you click it, it should take you out to the out. In my case, I already had this loaded up before, so I'm just going to start from scratch. But basically, if you click this, it'll take you to the out context, and you're going to be given two nodes, one for the IPR and one for the actual render output node. So by selecting the IPR node, you can left click and drag this render output node into it, and then when you're doing any kind of interactive rendering, it's going to be using this node or the information stored within this node to do that. Okay, so next up, because we already have this set up, now that we can actually start rendering, right? So let's try to render anything, and before you do anything really, you really should set up a camera. So no cam, just type in new cam, and at least you have something, right? But notice that as soon as I navigated out, your camera was lost. So let's just go back to cam and tie view to camera, so that this way, when you're navigating around, your camera is always locked. And the reason why is because the render output always requires the render camera to be set, right? So obj cam1. If you lose it, it's not going to render anything. Okay, so now if I try to go to controls and do a render, let's see what we're going to get. So we get this pop-up, this mplay window, and it's trying to build the scene. And as you can see, it says building Redshift scene. So all it really is right now doing is it's loading in the model, and now it's rendering. But it's going to be black, or rather, in this case, white, because there's no material attached. And at the same time, there's no environment, there's no lighting information, nothing. So it's going to look like crap. So you know what, let's stop this render and close this window. So we know two things. We need to add a light. So let's go back into, so let's just click on this icon here, out, go back to OBJ and add a light. So when we press tab, RS, let's choose a light dome. So we're going to get some kind of overall light. And then you go into the shader and choose a dome map. So I'm going to choose a texture, or an HDRI, and that's under my textures, HDRI, and I have textures from No Emotion. The path will be given to you in the description, and I'll choose something like Sunset E. Okay, and now let's try to do a render again. Right, so I'm going to go back to, actually this time I'm going to do something a little bit different. Instead of doing that, I'm going to click the IPR button over here in the shelf, and it's going to pop up the, the window again, the mplay, and it's going to be a little bit smaller because this is the IPR window, and it's using separate settings from the renderer that I was using previously. And this one's a little bit more interesting because now, if I navigate over here, you'll notice that it automatically updates over here, right? I forget if there's a way to make this on top. Is there? Anyways, doesn't matter. So as I navigate, it's actually going to automatically update this window. So now this looks a little bit more interesting, right? I mean, we have a background, we have some kind of lighting information in this scene, and the next part would be for me to actually start applying the materials that I exported. So let us create a material for this object and actually populate it using the textures that we've created within Painter. So I'm going to, within this object, press tab, shop, and create a shop network. There's a newer way to create textures now, or materials. I haven't really explored it yet, so I'm just going to do the old method. So left click and then press enter to enter it, and then create the material. So so all you really have to type in is RSM. So it'll take the first three letters, or rather it's going to find a node that closest resembles to whatever you typed in this case, RS material. When you place it, you get all the shader properties over here. I don't want to change this just yet. Actually, I can't really input my textures in here like you could in Maya. I have to actually go within the network and then add the individual nodes within there. But what I could do for now is make a test whether this material will work within on this object. So if I go back to the drone and then attach the material that I just made, so go to the material node, material, and then under obj drone shopnet rs material 1, the material that we made, press accept, and now you've attached the shader that we just made to this object. Okay. Now when I press IPR, I should very shortly get an interactive window, render window opening up, and the model is still going to be gray. So we're just going to wait until it builds the scene. So it's loading in the model, and so on. And once it builds the scene and does the render, it should still be gray. Okay. So now if you go back into the shopnet, select the material, and then change the color to red, for example, and then go back into the IPR, you'll notice that it is now red, which means that it has been connected to the model, which is good. But having the render window is actually, or rather, having the render window open, it's going to slow me down. So I'm going to stop and cancel that, and then we're going to do all the work within the material now. So in order to do any kind of work within this node, right now you'll notice that there's a lock on here, and that means the material is locked. So we have to right click on it and then go to allow editing of contents, and then that'll unlock this node and it'll give us the ability to go within it and actually make some edits. So here you have an output, and then you have the VOP node for the material. You want to double click and go within this, and here once again you have the Redshift material output, and you have the actual Redshift material node that you're going to be connecting other nodes into. Of course, right now you can't really see much because it is a collapsed node. So if you zoom in and you see these three gray lines, if you click on this icon, it'll expand the shader for you, and it'll give you all the inputs that you can plug it into. If you select the material, you're going to get all the properties on the side over here. So what we want to do now is apply some textures to this material, and that is done by pressing tab and then RST, which will refine your search. Now if you keep typing, so I already typed in RST text, so here you go. So RS text will give you the Redshift texture node, and I'm going to actually expand this as well. So now you can see that there's a color output, and then there's a bunch of inputs that you can plug into here as well. And I'm going to name this one diffuse, maybe even color on here, color. Okay, and this node will allow me to choose the textures that I'm going to be interested in. I'm going to copy this once more, and this time I'm going to type in metal, roughness or rough, and opacity, because I'm going to load all that one texture set in here, or rather that one node is going to be reading that texture set. So okay, now I want to also load the normal map. Okay, but that normal map is actually not a RS texture node, it's a separate node altogether. So press tab, type in RS norm, and then you'll see the RS normal map. Press enter. But this time, we're not going to be connecting it over to this shader, the material shader. We're going to be connecting this normal map over to the Redshift material output node. So if you zoom in and then left click and drag this into the bump, that's pretty much where it's going to go. Okay, so first of all, let's connect the diffuse color. So if we take the out color, we can put it into the diffuse color here. Okay. And it colors it like the connection is nice and green. This is good. But now if we go to metal rough opacity, if we try to out color this and put it into, for example, reflection metalness. Okay, so let me just zoom in just so you can see more clearly. So if we take this and plug it into reflection metalness, you'll notice that the line is all dotted. And that's because, I mean, it'll work, right? But what's not good about this is that because we have 3 channels within one texture, it's going to input the pinkish color into this metalness, right? Because it's inputting all the red, green, and blue. And rather, the result is not exactly what it's expecting. In this case, actually, I think it might work because it might just take the red color only, right? But if we want to export the green instead and put it into roughness over here, then it's not going to work quite how we expect. So we have to use if you type in tab and then type in RS color, and then here you have down here RS color splitter. We're going to be using this to split the channel into multiple pieces. So by default, as you can see now, it's solid shaded. So it's taken the RGB, it's put it into this color splitter node, and it's only outputting the R, the red channel, the metalness channel, into the metalness channel within this shader. But now the G is going to go directly into reflection roughness, and then the B would go into the opacity. But right now we're not going to be using that. So that's pretty much how you connect it. So we're only using one texture set, one texture node, and then we're using a color splitter to essentially choose which channel we want to feed into. And inside the normal map, again, we're going to be looking for textures and attaching them. So let's do that now. Let's go to diffuse color and find the textures that we're interested in. So go browse to your folder, and then in this case, I have the diffuse color _1001, so you can accept that. And then it's going to work, but it's only going to give me one texture, because right now it's diffuse color 1001. But if we go over to here, where it says 1001, and then delete that portion, and then do a bracket, so shift bracket, and then udim in all uppercase letters, and then bracket again, press enter. This is actually, it's kind of like that $sign texture set within Painter, but in this case, Redshift and Houdini understand a different tag, udim being it. It's actually the same tag within Maya, so, but the file node, the texture node, actually works a little bit different inside of Maya because you have an extra option somewhere in here where you can click on tiling and then choose Mari udim. Houdini doesn't have that, so you actually have to type that in. And because this is an sRGB map, I want to click on sRGB and enable the gamma override. For the metal roughness, though, I want to keep it raw, so I'm not going to change any gamma values at all. And then I have to just go here and then find the texture that I'm interested in. So in my case, the metal rough opacity, click accept, and again, change the udim tag. So udim, enter. And lastly, I want to find the normal map. So normal, accept, and it doesn't matter which one you choose. I mean, as long as it's somewhere in the normal map sequence, because the renderer in the end will find exactly the textures that it requires. Udim, bracket, enter. So now we have all the textures assigned to this, rather the materials assigned to the object. The textures are assigned to the shader, right, to the material. But there's one more thing we have to do, because right now we're using metal rough opacity, so we're using the metal workflow, metal roughness workflow. What that means is we have to change in the material the setting for the reflection. Now we can't do it from here, because these channels, the green channels, are actually linked to the material node above. So we have to go back in here. So we have to go back one level and another level. And inside this node now, we can change the properties for the material. So if we go under reflection, change this to GGX, and then Fresnel type, change this to metalness, because that's the workflow that we're using. And then do a IPR render. You should notice that it's going to look quite a lot different than it did last time. And as you can see, it's rendering now. And so, you know what, let me make this window. Hold on. Okay, so I've just basically minimized, or I shrunk it down the Houdini window. so I can always have this one visible. So if I go back to the viewport and I navigate around, you'll notice that this window will automatically update. So see how fast it's rendering? Redshift is pretty badass. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'll let it render. And so these are the colors pretty much that I'm getting out of Redshift itself. Now, what the next step, what I will want to do is I will want to use the same HDR map within Painter. And then once I have that, if the results look very close between Painter and Houdini, then I know that I'm on the right path, and then I could get back to texturing. So let me go back into Painter, and as you can see here, the environment map that I'm using, and that's under viewer settings, the environment map that I'm using is not the same that I'm using within Houdini. So we want to change that. But before I can use the environment map that I was using within Houdini, I'm actually going to have to shrink it down a little bit if I want to have more performance within Painter itself. Because here's the thing, the environment maps that come with Painter are rather small. They look good enough, but they're not really high in resolution, and so when you're navigating around, the performance is pretty good. If I load in one of the really high-res maps from No Emotion, because they're so bloody large, it actually ends up being very, very slow inside the viewport. So let me go into Photoshop, and here's a test that I was making. And I'm going to then go to Open, and then navigate to the Textures folder that I had. So Textures, HDRI, No Motion, Sunset, and then I was using this one over here, 808, Sunset E. When I open it, you'll notice that it is relatively large. So I'm going to check the image size, first of all, and then I'm going to shrink it. And I know exactly what size the Painter is using, and it's using 2048 by 124. So I'm going to use that in here as well. So Control H in my case, just to get rid of the grid. And when I go to image size, right now it's 15,000 by 7,500, which is a bit much. So I'm going to shrink this down to 2048, and it's going to be 124 right away, and just click OK. And now the texture is much smaller, but again, it gives me enough color information to get for lighting within Painter itself. So the only thing you have to really do now is just go to Save As, and this time save it to where Painter, like wherever you have your textures for Painter store. So in my case, I have my textures under Documents, Substance Painter 2, and if I go into this shelf, and then Environments, within here I have my texture already saved, so I'm just going to overwrite it, press Save. Do I want to replace it? Yes. And now when I go back into Painter, if I go into the environment over here, so Environments, I have two of them. One of them is large, one of them is smaller. Unfortunately, the thing is, you can't really tell which one is which. You just have to click it and then go to Opacity. And I'm going to be very... Actually, no, wait. If I just click it here, it's not going to make a difference. I actually have to choose it under Environment Map over here. So if I click one of these, it's going to update. And I'm guessing I've just chosen the big one because it's taking a very long time to update. And it took like 2 minutes. I mean, it looks nice, it's sharp, but it took a bit long. As you can see, it's a little bit chuggy. So now I'm actually going to change this environment map to the second one. And this one is lower in resolution, but it's also much faster to navigate around. So the last thing I might want to do, in my case, is navigate to an angle that looks kind of similar to what I had in Houdini, right? And then go over into the environment map, and lastly just rotate it to whatever I have over here, right? So I can see one of these streak clouds. So anyways, the results are kind of close, right? I mean, obviously one of them is a full out render, the other one's not. The angle is not exactly the same. Maybe the exposure might be just slightly stronger or something like that. And obviously the gamma in the renderer is slightly different, but I mean, again, it looks pretty damn close. So that's pretty much I think the end of this chapter. I've taken the textures that I've exported previously, I've put them inside of Houdini, piped them up, set it all up in there, made the render, and then compared it between Substance Painter and also used the same HDRI between the two to then be able to compare looks. So this is pretty much the workflow for look development, right? You want to assign the colors, make sure you test them, and then once you got that stage done, then you can get back into the actual texturing and focus on the details. But at least this way you'll know that when you export whatever textures out of Painter, they will look the same within the application that you're rendering in, right? So that's very, very important. And this way there's going to be no surprises. And now I can actually save my Houdini file, and the only thing I have to do is just update the textures, and that's it. And before I go, just a little bit heads up as far as Redshift goes. Go to out if you want to. Actually, you know what? I'll give you some settings if you want to render a little bit better. So what I usually do with this render output node is I'll go into IPR, overwrite the camera resolution, and actually, you know what? No, go to user specified, and I'll type in something like 1920 by 1080. 80. And then as far as the render settings go, I'll go to Redshift tab, and within here under memory, I'll increase this to like 2000. Now, granted, I have a Titan X in here and a Titan, so I have, well, as far as this render is concerned, because I'm a Titan, I'm limited to 6 gigs. So I'm going to say I'm going to use about 2 gigs for the RAID reserved memory. This will actually increase your render speed a lot, so make sure you bump this up to at least a gig. The CPU texture cache, just go all the way up. This, I usually like to use about a gig, and then I just bump all these up just ever so slightly. So that's where I start, right? Next up, I go into the global illumination, and I go under primary GI engine, I go to brute force, and I choose brute force again. And then under refraction, the scene doesn't really have much in terms of refraction, so you know what, I'm just going to limit it. I will later on when I have opacity. I'm not really concerned about it right now. And then under the settings, the min samples, max samples, if you want to have decent quality, I would say min samples 12 or something like that, and then 128. And then change the adaptive error threshold to 0.004. And I think that is all. Oh yeah, and here's the thing. So IPR, actually no, I've already done that. And then you might want to do the same thing for the main if you want to do a regular render, override, and just go to user specified and then type in the actual resolution that you render at or want to render at. Otherwise, you have to go into controls and then specify the resolution, you know, whether you want to use the natural resolution and all that stuff, right? So actually it doesn't seem like I can actually change it in this node. Regardless, override this, specify it, and then render from there. So that's pretty much it. You know what? Let's do a render, quick render, and then we're out.